So the new theater for version 5.7 has just came out, and before we go take a look, this is the visual for all the basic information that you might need to know in case you haven't done this mode before. Feel free to pause the video to take a look. And one more thing is that these videos are usually made with visionary mode in mind. However, if you're playing some of the easier difficulties, you can reflect all the necessary tips that I will be giving later on for your respective difficulty. Now, the elements this time around are Pyro, Hydro, and Cryo, making the possible reactions between Vaporize, Melt, and Freeze. For the casts, the opening casts which are mandatory to pick between your own units or the trial units provided are Linny, Shengling, Tartaglia, Dahlia, Raisti, and Rosaria. On the other hand, the special casts, which are characters that ignore the elemental restriction but can only be brought if you own them and they meet the requirements for the builds, are Kinish, Emily, Lanyan, and lastly, Noelle. Now, to start off with the general tips, the first tip, which is the obvious one, use supporting casts whenever you do need the help. Ideally, try to use them if you do have in-game friends that have really well-built character and they happen to also put the characters in the lineup, so usually between dolphins, whales, or any long-term veteran players. Tip number 2 is generally prioritizing characters over buff, because Theatre is a bit different from Abyss, where if you don't have at least 4 characters to do a challenge, you will simply fail the run and be forced to restart. If you want to know how much characters you have, check it in the Performance Details tab, usually on the bottom left of your screen. However, if you do have enough characters, you can consider getting a few buffs here and there, which will be explained in a separate section later. Tip number 3 is always choose the weaker enemies for an easier time, because you do not get rewarded for choosing harder enemies, with the exception of doing elite challenges. Examples will be provided later on. And lastly, try to throw away your weaker or less invested units in the earlier acts such as Act 1 and Act 2, because this allows you to save a lot of your stronger units for later acts. Of course, if you're trying to go for the Stellar, you do need to try to keep that in mind, because if your units are too weak in the earlier acts, you might not even be able to get the Stellas in the first place. Now let's move on with the act tips. Starting with Act 1, the easiest is going to be the Ruin Drake and the Ruin Grader combo. You only have to deal with really one of them, and while they do have the weak point mechanics, I think this is one of the lowest DPS check required, so definitely an option that I would always recommend all the time. The other semi-easy option is definitely going to be the Wayop. Now, you guys probably know how the Wayop works by now. Starts off with the Trials move for the next 13 seconds and creates a white shield. Break the white shield in order to stun it and basically get all your energy back. He does absorb energy the moment he starts the move. There are ways around it, and let's say if you fail to break the shield, it will convert the remaining white shield into an elemental shield based on their respective element. And you can do 2 things, and because we do have freeze, you can technically use freeze in order to prevent it to do the move, or you can use certain elemental bursts like, let's say, Xingqiu burst or Kea burst to some extent in order to stagger it, as the footage is showing right now, so that you can prevent it from doing the trials move in the first place. However, if your team has enough investment, you can simply unleash all your bursts super early on, and you should be able to shred the shield really freaking fast, and he will have the lowest amount of HP and DPS required out of all 6 options. The okay option, if you don't bring a Hydro DPS, would definitely be the Lava Churl, Hydro Fungi, and the Hydro Slime option. You can just bring Cryo or Pyro, or either way. You only have to do with really just like a few of them, and it's really straightforward. Lava Churl, when he spawns, just make sure he faces the edge of the arena so that when he jumps towards the wall and not halfway across the map. For the other 3 options, they're all simply annoying. I'm going to elaborate very briefly. The rest, the robots are doable. They're not the easiest, but they're not the hardest. It's just a few of them. And then the Elite Assault will definitely have a higher scaling compared to the regular chambers. But once again, they are robots, so there's not really much for us to say here. The worst and one that I don't really recommend is simply the Hilichurl Rogue combo. You're going to have to do 3 waves with these guys, and these Metachurls are actually the shield, wooden shield Metachurls, so you do have to burn their shield down first, which does get quite annoying, and you have to do 3 waves of them, which will stall a lot of times, so I highly do not recommend this one. Now for Act 2, we do have quite a good abundance of easy options. Dendro Breacher Primus is of course very straightforward. Ideally, you bring between Pyro and Hydro to remove the Dendro Shield, or any, Arca aligned characters. I'm sure I'm going to put the list right now, but you probably know the Fontaine characters, so I'm not going to explain. Whenever you start, the only grouping strategy is go all the way to the right or the left, and then give it like 5 to 10 seconds. Once the second Breacher Primus is grouped next to the other one, which can be shown by the fact that they both start doing the Dendro shield phase, then you can go back to it and hit them both at once for the fastest clear time. For the other option, the Geo Breacher Primus is also quite decent. You only have to deal with like a few of the smaller variants and one of the big one. They do have a Geo Shield, but once again, it's not too relevant. If you do enough damage, the shield shouldn't really be that much of a problem to you because it only gives damage reduction or by high resistance rather than actual like permanent damage invulnerability. The third option doesn't really want pyro, as shown by the icon here. It's simply just the pyro avatars of lava. You only have to kill 2 of them. Just bring your hydro DPS or cryo DPS, apply melt or vape, and that should be pretty straightforward. Now the other 2 okay options would be between the Fatui enemies. The Fatui enemies, you only have to do with like I think 1 of each for these guys. The first wave is the first 3 of these, and then the second wave is simply 1 operative. I think in terms of numerical wise, I think these guys would be the easier of the 2. The other one, you have to do 3 waves, like 1 Nobushi, 1 male Fatui, and then the Sissin Mage, which I think there's like 2 of each. So it can get pretty annoying. It is okay for me personally, but it's not something I would definitely recommend. And of course, the tough one is going to be the Cryo Lava Chill Hilacho Rogue combo. You have to do 2 waves of them, rogues into the 2 Cryo Lava Chills. They will give you extra flowers though, so if you do have pyro units and a good enough team, you can try, but personally, I don't think it's worth it. For the first boss in Act 3, we do have Nemesis of Coppelius. He'll start at the center of very high resistance, and then after a bit of time, he will send Coppelia to the outer ring and spawning a Cryo Shield. The Cryo Shield is best broken with obviously the Pyro element, but can also be broken in one hit with Uxia attacks. Notably, the ones that qualify for this theater are Cheverus Elemental Skill, Furina's normal attack in her damage mode, Siege Wind's Elemental Skill, and lastly, Rise the Burst. Every time you break the shield, obviously you can do the straightforward damage before Coppelia comes back to Coppelius at the center. Applying Uxia a total of 3 times during this single attack will interrupt the whole attack, forcing Coppelia to return to Coppelius and going back to the regular attack phase. Keep in mind he will generate the shield 3 times, so be sure to time your any sort of rotations according to when he shields up. Otherwise, there's no notable strategy. He does have high cryo and a Nemo resistance, which if you are running a cryo DPS, it's not really recommended unless for some reason you have the maximum frozen buff, which gives you like 24% res shred to some extent. That is something that you can definitely consider. But otherwise, just bring a pyro DPS, just bring your Shangling if you do have it by now. So for Act 4, we do have 2 easy options, one notably being the Secret Source Automaton, the Hunter Seeker, and the Pyro Avatar of Lava. The notable mechanic for these 2 is, I think the Hunter Seeker has a bar. It starts with very high resistance. Build up the bar by being in the Night Soul Blessing state, so notably not long characters. Once it's full, he does the big laser and gets stunned for like a short time with lowered resistance, but shouldn't matter too much. Pyro Avatars of Lava has a bar. You build up the Pyro bar with obviously Pyro hits and elemental application. And I think every threshold, every now and again, it reaches a threshold where it will take like a good amount of damage. Filling the bar will essentially kill him immediately, but it's not too relevant because that will never happen if you have enough DPS. You can do this thing called the Pacifist Run strategy, where you basically just do enough damage to draw aggro because both of these enemies or these challengers only have one of them at a time. So you can just simply continue damaging them and drawing their attention while just stalling for the next 3 minutes. You don't even have to try to kill them. You just make sure that they don't hit the monolith, and as long as the monolith is above 60% HP, you should be fine. For the other options, we do have the okay ones. We have the 2 different Lava Chill variants. One is Cryo and one is just Geo. The neutral element, you can definitely go for the Geo one. There's really nothing going on. You don't even need to bring like Pyro or Cryo to deal with the Electro Lava Chill because it's like whatever. But if you do want to go against a Cryo Lava Chill, I think ideally bring Cryo and Pyro like a melt team because, well, if you don't remove their shield, they're going to have quite a bit of resistance, so they don't take as much damage as they should. And for the other last options, the robots are simply annoying because they do have range attacks and they spawn very spread out. And the elite one is of course going to be a bit tough because at first you're only going to deal with 2 of these Ruin Sentinels. And then after you kill a certain amount, the Ruin Graders will, or the Ruin Guards and the Ruin Graders will actually start to spawn. So you have to deal with 3 enemies at the same time, which may not necessarily be the best course of action. So for Act 5, the easiest one for the kills is definitely going to be the Ruin Grader and Ruin Guard combo. You simply only have to kill 4, I think 4 in order to get the Stella and 4 to get the clear and 5 to get the Stella. They spawn literally right next to each other. This is literally a freebie. Now as for all the other okay-ish option, we do have the 2 Rift Hounds, either Geo or Electro. They do apply corrosion, which does drain your HP over time, but that's not too relevant because you're probably going to end up like with your regular characters with 30k HP, so they're never going to do enough damage for that. Now, the nice thing is that the strategy for these two is that you simply just want to target the small dogs first, because I believe you only have to kill 7 in order to clear, 9 in order to get the Stella, and I think the first 4 to 5 enemies that you can target is definitely the small ones before they run out and they start spawning the big Rift Hounds. So they do have much less HP than the big guys, so it's really very easy and they tend to stay quite grouped up. Now for the OK option, I think the Ruin Robots, I think you have to kill like 7 to 9. It's also a similar one. And if I recall correctly, they probably spawn anti-clockwise, but you know, that one, it's not really that big of a deal. They're a bit more on the tankier side, so if you don't have enough DPS, you don't really have to do this. As for the tough one, we do have the Elite Assault. I did try this on a viewer's account. It was definitely tougher than I expected. They do have quite a bit of HP and they don't really like grouping easier. The first wave, just simply go to the ranged lady to the left because she is a ranged unit. So you go to her and the other 2 melee units will naturally come to you. You can also do this to get 20 extra Fantasia flowers. Now, the most annoying one is definitely going to be the Nabushis because while they are very weak, Hoyo is very aware of this and they make it so that you have to kill 15 of them in order to clear, 18 in order to get the stars. Even in my own account, I just barely got it with some time remaining, so I highly do not recommend this. And they only spawn in waves of 3, so you have to kill like 5 waves of them and they spawn like clockwise, so it's just very annoying to try to keep track of things. Now, for the Solitary Suanni in Act 6, this is essentially just what do you call it again? A cryo gimmick boss, but more of like a cryo breaking boss. So essentially the mechanic is like this. Whenever it applies Hydro onto itself, you have to freeze him, and then you have to break it with any attacks, whether blunt attacks like Claymore or plunging attacks, or any cryo reactions aside from freeze, like superconduct or melt. And then once you do that, you actually stun it for about 10 seconds or so with, but basically that's your best damage window. So the 2 most notable moves is that it does have the Hydro and Anemo move. After a certain amount of attacks, it will imbue itself with Hydro and create water spools or water spouts everywhere and start charging up with really high resistance. You basically have to play the freeze mechanic, apply cryo, then break the freeze, you'll stun it for a little bit. If you don't, you're going to be losing quite a lot of damage here because you are very time restricted. And then after a few moves afterward, it will do the Anemo move, where it summons 3 Anemo balls that circles around it. Hit the balls with elements like Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo in order to break him, and then once you break all 3 of the balls, he will be stunned for another 10 seconds. Now, the Cryo mechanic is not entirely necessary if you have enough buffs and your team can do enough damage. And the one thing that I did notice is that usually it only does the big moves only when its HP is 70% and below. However, it is possible for you to delay the move if you can get it to about roughly 50 to 60% HP before it even does it in the first place. From my observations, this will basically make it do 1 extra attack, which allows like additional DPS to increase your chances of getting the clear. Now, in terms of the attack pattern, it's generally quite fixed. It just stands up after like spawning for about 5 seconds plus or 10 seconds also like that. And then afterwards, it does like swing into the slam. The second attack, it doesn't really matter what the second attack is, but after the second attack, the third attack is usually going to be the Hydro move. If you do enough damage, you can definitely stall it to make it to the 4th attack. So once you do get that, you can freeze it, break it, 10 seconds of free time. And for some reason, after it does the Hydro move, it will basically imbue itself with Hydro and do a 0 damage lunge. This is also another freebie for you. If you can apply Cryo to break it here, that's another 10 seconds of stun before it does the Anemo move right afterwards. It generally repeats this pattern roughly, so you can use this information as you need to in order to kind of predict and time your abilities. And before I forget, keep in mind it does have very high Hydro resistance, so please do not bring a Hydro DPS unless you have units that can shred that 70% Hydro resistance. Now for Act 7, we do have quite a few options. The easiest one's going to be the 2 Consecrated Beasts. While they do have high resistance to their own elements and a few other ones, it doesn't really matter because their HP is the lowest out of all 6 options. The notable mechanic is that once their HP is low enough, they'll unleash their special move, which creates a phagocytic block. These blocks can be broken with elemental attacks, and the fastest if hit with their respective element. Upon breaking the blocks, you just have to hit the corresponding beast again, and that will stun them for a bit, make them lose a lot of resistance and HP, and they'll be stunned for the next 10 seconds, but if you have enough damage, they will be dead before you even get here. For the other OK options, we do have, I guess, a shared amount between the robots and the Baptismal V-Shap. I think the Baptismal V-Shap, you have to deal with like 2 of the hatchlings, which is the Cryo and Electro, and then 2 of the adult ones. Unfortunately, the V-Shaps tend to get staggered very easily, so I don't really recommend them between the 2. Robots are very straightforward. They're a little bit more than the V-Shaps, but they're not that tanky and they tend to not move too much. So between the 2, I think robots would be a nice side option. For the other options, we do have the Pyro Mage and Abyss Lecter combo. This is just a matter of a Hydro check. HP wise, they're not that tanky. Grouping will get a bit annoying, but if you have enough Hydro characters with enough AoE, this shouldn't really be that big of a problem. So if you do have enough good Hydro characters with good Hydro application, you can definitely go for this one. The double Wyop is situational, because you could technically unleash your burst really early for both the Wyops and get it done fast, but if your team does not have enough DPS, or you don't run a team that's not reliant on burst, then it can be quite tough. So take it based on what you have, but there's no reason for you to do this when you have all the other 3 options. The Xuanwen Beast with the Husk Knights is definitely the toughest one because you do have to deal with quite a lot of them, and they are in the elite chambers, so they will have more HP than usual. Strategy here, Xuanwen Beast is also a cryo mechanic. Just like the Suanni, you apply freeze on them, and then once you break their freeze, they'll get stunned for a bit. There's 4 of them, just choose the one at the furthest back corner, and then the other 3 will slowly and ever so slowly group to you. Then the second wave will be the Serpent Knights or the Husk Knights. Now, there are 3 different ones. They do have the mechanic where they activate their abilities whenever they hit you with a shield. So if you do have a shield, try to really be careful for a little bit. But the strategy here is to go for the Cryo Archer. I think this one should be to the left. And then the other 3 enemies will slowly group towards you. Deal with the Cryo Archer and then go to the Pyro Flag Bearer guy. The rest, once again, are melee characters, so they all tend to go towards you. And then the rest is really just a rinse and repeat. I would recommend saving the Geo unit for last, and if he does generate like a shield in front of it, just walk past the shield and he will deactivate it. But other than that, that's all there is to say about this act. Now for Act 8, we do have the Goldflam Qucusaur Tyrant with very high resistance early on. Give it a bit of time and then it will fly up in the air and enter its Pyro flight form. Now most of the time this one is not really hittable and it does generate a Pyro shield, unless you happen to have Furina, which this is the part where you want to get Furina if you can. But otherwise, just wait for it to do its Feather Barrage attack, and then afterwards it will spawn 2 Pyro Feathers on the ground. One Pyro Feather will be aimed towards you, the other Pyro Feather will spawn to the right of where you were looking. Break both feathers with elemental attacks that is not Pyro in order to bring it to low altitude mode. Once you break both feathers, the Qucusaur himself will go to the ground and create a small AoE explosion. Just get ready all your respective Hydro or Cryo abilities by then so that you can bring down the Pyro Shield as fast as possible. Once you actually bring it down, the rest is really just, well, the same as always. Just keep doing damage, stay in front of it. Be sure to bring enough DPS though, because you definitely need it because he is definitely a little bit tankier than a lot of the other enemies. Now for Act 9, we have quite a lot of easy options, so thank goodness. The most neutral element one would definitely be the Saurian adults. All you have to do is kill the adult Saurians. They do have 30% resistance to their own elements, but it shouldn't matter too much. I believe you only have to kill about 4 or 5 of them in order to get the Stellas, so that's something. Now for the other 3 easy options is very element dependent. Against the Cryo Lawachol, I believe you only have to kill about 2 or 3 of them if I'm not wrong. However, if you do bring Pyro, it would be recommended here so you can actually shred the Cryo Shield and maximize your damage. But if you don't, it's not that big of a loss either. Just make sure you don't bring Cryo DPS because you're going to be losing a lot of damage since he does have high Cryo resistance. Now for the other options, Pyro Avatar of Lava, do not bring a Pyro character. It has 70% Pyro resistance. However, if you bring any Hydro character here, you're going to be getting absolute stonks. You bring someone like Molani, you only have to kill 2 of them, so you can just trigger Vape very, very easily. And for the last option is the Hydro Phantasms. Don't bring Hydro because they're immune to Hydro. But other than that, you only have to kill 3 of them. And yeah, pretty straightforward. The other options are annoying. The Electro Abyss Mage, you have to kill like 8 of them. And they're very spread out. They refuse to group up for the life of it. Even if you bring Cryo and Pyro to have really fast application, it's not going to guarantee you the clear, so please don't pick this. If you want to go for a bit of a DPS check, the highest DPS check in the game aside from bosses right now will be the Ruin Grader, Ruin Guard combo. You only have to kill, I believe it's like 1 Grader, 1 Guard and 1 Grader, totaling up to 3. You can get the 20 Last Fantasia Flowers if you do need it for the final act. So if you do have enough damage, that's definitely a team or an option that you can consider. And lastly, Act 10 is the Cryogamic Overseer device. It will start with a special move where it summons 2 lasers with very high resistance, and it just does hydro damage. The bar will build up over time, and it will become stronger and do more damage. So ideally, you do want to have enough cryo application in order to deal with this boss. Preferably bring 2 cryo units. If not, bring 1 cryo unit that is like, applies a lot of cryo, like let's say Risey normal attack or you're spamming Ayaka normal attack. But for my personal experience, try to at least bring 2 cryo units here. Because once you deplete the bar below a certain point, you should see like this cryo mist effect on the boss, which means it will enter a frozen flow state where it essentially has negative resistance to everything. Notably, it will take a lot of damage to cryo itself, so try to build a team around cryo DPS. So other than that, there's not really much for me to say. I mean, I want to say there's the whole Night Soul Blessing mechanic in the Counter-Strike mode, where you can basically enter Night Soul Blessing and maintain it, and it will build up a separate bar indicated by the ring on the outside. Once it's full, it will enter the Counter-Strike mode, which will decrease its resistance from 210% to 50%. So if you do have some amount of red shred, maybe you bring like Mawika or something like that, that's definitely something you can try. Other than that, that's pretty straightforward. There's nothing much I can say about this boss. Please bring 2 cryo units at least, and bring whatever cryo DPS you have. Hopefully by now, you should have all the good buffs, which I will explain in the section after this. Now, I'm gonna briefly explain them, but I'll talk about my recommendations. So Vaporize, as you can tell, the elements this time around is really freaking strong. So if we start off with Origin, you trigger Vaporize, you basically get 25% Pyro and Hydro Red Shred, which, to be frank, I think all 3 elements have really good origins, so try to get at least level 1 of them, all of the origins, even if you don't want to go too far in. Then we have 2 options, the Pyro option or the Hydro option. Hydro sends, you trigger Vaporize, you send like this little tidal wave which does AoE Hydro damage, and then of course we do have the Pyro version, which basically creates a small explosion. I don't usually use the Pyro one. Personally, I prefer the Hydro one because the Hydro one, unlike the Pyro one is just a simple explosion at that location. Hydro one is a literal tidal wave that does move forward, so it does have a bit of AoE, so personally I prefer the Hydro path. Evolution increases the red shred from 25% to 30%, and we have 3 paths. The Hydro path, it basically increases the damage of your tidal wave from level 2, as well as the AoE. If you don't have, let's say, good personal damage, you can go for this. Pyro 1, it basically adds 2 chain explosions after the first one occurs. And if you happen to get this, which all of this is kind of random by the way, the neutral path, you basically just get 50% more Vaporize damage. And to be frank, out of all of these buffs, I think level 1 alone is enough if your team is already pretty strong. But if you do want the additional damage, I would personally recommend the Hydro version instead of the Pyro one, because the Pyro one is stationary, the Hydro one has bigger AoE, and yeah, straightforward. Now for Melt, let's look at all the buffs. Melt Origin is basically like AoE. You trigger the Pyro variant of Melt, you get AoE Cryo. You trigger Cryo Melt, you get the AoE Pyro. This is every 4 seconds. Now we have 2 different paths, which is of course, one is the external damage path and the other one is the personal damage path. For the first one, Basic Thermocline, you basically gain more damage and AoE for that AoE from the extra damage that you do. Or you can get Basic Expanse, where you get 30% more melt damage after triggering the AoE Pyro Cryo damage from the initial buff. Level 3 basically increases the damage of the external damage, and then we have 3 branching paths for level 4. The top one, you basically get more damage, AoE, as well as an additional instance of the external damage. For the second one, Extreme Prohibition, whenever that external damage hits the opponent, they will lose 40% Pyro and Cryo Res. And lastly, Extreme Thermoflash. Whenever the buff is active, whenever you trigger the initial Origin buff, I think it was Basic Expanse or something. Whenever the Melt buff is active, you'll basically get 90% crit damage. Honestly, there's nothing much more to say. If you don't have enough investment, go for the external damage route. If you want personal damage, go for the personal damage route. And lastly, we do have Frozen. Frozen, of course, is also pretty crack. Origin, you trigger Frozen, you basically gain 40% Hydro and Cryo crit damage. It's really good. And of course, we do have the external damage route and the personal damage route at the bottom. For the top half, you basically have the same thing as the Melt. If Cryo triggers Frozen, you get AoE Hydro. If Hydro triggers Frozen, AoE Cryo, and this triggers on the enemy's position. Personal damage buff at Rime Rupture, you trigger the Frozen, and with this initial buff active, you basically get a stack on the enemy, which decreases their resistance by 8% for both Hydro and Cryo. Maximum 24% Res Shred. Evolution, you get another 10% more crit damage from Origin, leading it up to 50%. And level 4, we do have 2 paths. So the personal damage path, you have Acute Cold Snap, where you get 2 additional instants for the initial external damage. Or you can get Foremost Frigid Flurry, which increases the AoE and decreases the trigger interval from every 6 seconds to every 3 seconds. Now this one is a bit of an interesting one because I think from my calculation, because the initial buff triggers every 6 seconds, it's technically better to go for Acute Cold Snap if you don't need too much AoE, because you get 3 instances of damage every 6 seconds compared to the second variant, which does more damage. But I think last I did a calculation on it, I think the damage itself is not really that much different. It just has bigger range and slightly shorter interval. So personally, I think it's just better to just go for Acute Cold Snap if you do want the external damage. For personal damage path, Ravaging Rupture, you get the max rest shred from the Rhyme Rupture one. You get 50% increased cryo damage on that specific enemy, or of course the Hydro variant with Ravaging Runoff. Now, in terms of the actual combo, I would say the best one is definitely going to be Vaporize. I can just open it right here. If generally you just want to choose about 1 level of each of the buffs, because like they provide some form of rest shred one way or another. But I would say out of all 3 reactions, I think my favorite one is easily Vaporize, because you get a lot of personal damage right here. Well, a decent amount of personal damage, and I've been using the Hydro path because the Tide itself has pretty good AoE and the damage is no joke. Now, if we look at all the other ones, let's see. Frozen level 1 is already quite good already. You can probably stop at level 2. Level 4 is kind of optional. You can go for level 3 for another 10% more crit damage. And if you pair them up together with, let's say, like Melt, the best thing you can do is probably stop at the level 2 to get more melt damage. But if you want to go all the way, ideally I would recommend either the Cryo Rest or the crit damage. But the thing about these buffs, right, for some reason Vaporize and Melt are the only 2 reactions that have like 3 paths. So because they're completely RNG, there's a chance you may get both the Hydro and Pyro variant, and there's a very rare chance that you get this extra one. I don't know why. It's the same thing for Melt. Like, it's so hard for me to try to get this 90% crit damage buff, but if you do happen to get it, then let's just say you're a bit luckier than usual. Anyways, that's it for the Imaginarium Theatre guide. If you do have any questions, do leave them down in the comments section below. If you find this video to be helpful or enjoyable, slap that like button, and if you'd like to see more content, hit the subscribe button, and I'll be trying to grind up more videos, I would say, for the next few months, because I do want to try more new things. Other than that, that's it for now. This is Ethereal, signing off, wishing you the best of luck for all your future endeavors, and hoping that you can get the 9 Stellas for that sweet, sweet sanctifying elixir. Peace out, everyone.